you want to be changing and influencing policy and political decisions, which is perfectly legitimate in a democracy. But when you're doing that, surely you need to disclose the people who are funding your work.
No. Why? People should evaluate the arguments on their own terms and say, I agree with it or I don't agree with it. And I've never seen that question. Okay, you probably don't mean this entirely literally now, but I've never seen anyone ask that question really in good faith.
The Institute for Economic Affairs, the IEA, is a think tank based in Westminster, London. It's been around for more than 50 years, was very closely associated with the premiership of one Margaret Thatcher, and more recently came to be associated with Liz Truss. Remember her? So it's fair to say that the IEA is on the right of politics. They're free market liberals, they're neoliberals. They want more markets, less state. Naturally, over the years, I've disagreed with them, I've jousted with them online. Dare I say, after Liz Truss, I even teased a few of them. And we thought it was time to get somebody from the IEA in the same room as myself. We could talk about all the things that we disagree about. Today's guest is an economist from the IEA. They have a rather, I think, funny persona online. Kristian Niemietz, welcome to Downstream.
My pleasure. It had to happen eventually.
It had to happen eventually. The Waluigi of the IEA to the Luigi of Novara Media. The evil Kermit. You might not see it that way.
Either way, we got to give the people what they want.
Yeah, which is a good old debate, conversation.
Absolutely.
Maybe we even agree on something, I don't know. You are yourself German.
Mm-hmm.
From whereabouts in Germany?
From the southwest, from the wine route, state of Rhineland-Palatinate.
Very nice. Very nice. Very underrated German wine.
Absolutely, yeah.
And let's establish your credentials very quickly. You're an economist at the IEA.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? How did you get there? What were you doing before you had that job?
Okay, long story. I was an intern there in 2006. I first came across them when I was still at university. I went to a classical liberal free market conference in Berlin and saw the then Director General of the IEA, who talked about the history of the Institute, how they were influential in the 70s and 80s. And I thought, that sounds interesting. That I didn't really know at the time what a think tank even was. But I thought I'll apply there for an internship because it sounds like something I might enjoy. So I also realized I was ideologically close to them. And then when I was there, I just realized I felt at home there because I was studying economics at the time. But when you study mainstream economics, it's just fairly lifeless. It's very sterile. It's 90% mathematical models. Whereas when I was at the IEA, they did it in a very different way. There was much more interest in the history of economic ideas and the different economic schools of thoughts and how, whatever, you might have the classical economists and the neoclassics and the Austrian school and the Marxists and all that sort of approach. And it was also, what I didn't like about economics in the purely academic sense was that there's this fake neutrality. If you want to write for an academic journal, you have to pretend not to have opinions on things. Whereas with an IEA publication, it would always be clear where the author was coming from. So I much preferred that style of writing and doing research. And 2 years later, I went back there, initially part-time. I was still doing degree in King's College at the same time and just took on more hours at the IEA and went full-time eventually.
So for people who don't know, the IEA is a very ideological think tank, very old think tank as well. I mean, it's created in, the early 60s?
Technically 1955, but it didn't initially do anything. So, yeah, it depends on how you count it again.
And the guy, you need to illuminate this for me, the guy who sets it up makes his money out of battery chickens.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Anthony something?
Anthony Fisher, yes.
Anthony Fisher, there you go.
Yeah, he set it up. He read The Road to Serfdom, I think it must have been just after the Second World War, and that won him over to Hayekian ideas. And then he wanted to initially go into politics, but then he met the actual Hayek at the LSE, who said to him, no, you won't achieve anything in politics as long as the climate of opinion is completely against you, which would have been the case in the immediate post-war period. And he said to him, you need to reach the opinion formers, people in the media, in the education sector, arts and culture. And the idea being that once you reach these people, that will filter through, that will, in the long term, change the climate of opinion in a more liberal direction. That was what he was hoping for. And Hayek's idea was that if you do that, politics will eventually follow, but you can't start with politics. So the idea should not be to directly influence politicians. It should really be, the focus should be on the opinion formers. And that was basically the blueprint for what would later become the IEA.
So this is kind of like a Gramscian theory of change almost.
I guess so, yeah.
To some extent. If you're on the left, again, people might not know what that means. But effectively, the formulation came from Andrew Breitbart. Politics is downstream from culture. And the idea is that you change prevailing common sense, prevailing ideas. And then on that, 10, 20, 30 years later, politicians come around to your way of thinking. And that's basically what happens with the IEA. They're around from the 1960s. They're very close to Keith Joseph, a very important supporter of Margaret Thatcher. I think he was the only member of the shadow cabinet that supported Margaret Thatcher when she went for the Tory leadership in 1975. People don't know that.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, she was a real outsider. It's a bit like Corbyn, you know. Oh, we've never had anybody who was such an outsider, not really with a base inside their party. That's exactly what's happening with Thatcher in the 70s. In terms of the power brokers in our party, anyway.
Yeah, but that was exactly the idea, that a lone Thatcher-like figure wouldn't be able to achieve much. There has to be at least some support, and obviously it was, either way, it was still controversial, all of her reforms, but it was at least a basis of support. And to what extent that is due to think tanks, it's always hard to tell. You would need to have a window into a parallel universe where everything is exactly the same, minus the think tank sectors or wherever else. Ideas may come from, say, institutions like the Mont Pelerin Society, also set up by Hayek. But yeah, that was very much the idea, that you need to prepare the ground first, change the climate of opinions, and then hopefully politics will eventually follow.
So when lefties talk about this stuff, like Owen Jones or us here at Novara Media, I mean, Owen seems to get it in the neck the most. It's portrayed by some people in the political centre as a conspiracy theory. The idea that there were people with a political project, they had a reverence for early capitalism as they saw it, and they wanted to return to the liberal principles which underpinned pre-1929 capitalism, or let's say pre-Second World War capitalism. And that infused a very overt, intentional political project by people like the IEA, Keith Joseph, Thatcher, and that's called neoliberalism. And there are lots of people in the centre ground of politics, in this country in particular, people like John Rentoul at The Independent or whatever. And until a couple of years ago, I don't know about now, they would say there's no such thing as neoliberalism. This is all a conspiracy theory. It's all made up. And this is just leftist cope. So reassure me, Kristian, this is not a conspiracy theory. This was a clear, diligent, conscientious political project, right?
But there is also a conspiracy around it. So if you type Tufton Street on Twitter, 99% of the results you will get, that will be pure conspiracy theory. That will be people who think that we somehow pull the strings in the background, that we are like Bond villains controlling the political process. That is not how it works. And that was never the idea. It's a much more indirect process. It really is about filtering through and changing the climate of opinion, reaching opinion formers. That doesn't mean that you get to determine any particular policy. So you might then, and that's why I said that it's hard to say in hindsight whether think tanks had an influence on this or that. So there was somebody who wrote about the Thatcher privatizations later on. I think it was him, David Parker, who wrote about what's the evidence actually for how this happened and what the consequences were. And I think it was him, unless I'm confusing him with someone, who said, well, he talked to some of the people who made it happen at the time, asked them, did you get these ideas from think tanks? And they said, no, what is a think tank? So it's always hard to tell. You can't directly trace what a think tank or a comparable organization does to any particular policy outcomes. And I guess that's where the conspiracy theory comes in. Most of the people who hate us think that we somehow directly write policies or that we can somehow make policies happen. And that's not how it works.
Less so now, but you did have a lot of power. You did have a lot of power, especially under Thatcher. I mean, the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, these were really powerful organisations, right?
It depends on, well, I wouldn't say powerful. There's a difference between influential and powerful. So if you look at IEA publications from the time, the people who wrote for the Institute then, they didn't necessarily have the impression that they're winning and that now everything is going according to plan. So back in the day, they would still have had quite a bit of distance to the Thatcher project and see it quite critically. And I think that's also true of Hayek himself, that we had a relative of Hayek who used to come to the Institute and who said, well, that relationship between Hayek and Thatcher, it wasn't exactly mutual. So she may have been a Hayek admirer, but that doesn't mean that he had the impression that now his ideas were becoming a reality.
I mean,
so
she did famously get a copy of his, book, and his most important book, slam it on a table and go, this is what we believe.
Yeah, she clearly took him very seriously as a political economic thinker. But I don't think she would have gone to him to say, write a budget proposal for me, or come up with a legislative proposal for this or that. So that wouldn't be how it works. It's much more about general principles.
If you're enjoying this conversation and you want to see more debates, let me know. Put it in the comments. Message me. I'm on X, of course. Email me, Aaron@Novara Media. Not everybody thinks that debates are good. I do. I think we need more of them. We need to know where people stand. Alongside getting in touch and feeding back about these kinds of conversations, whether you like them or not, I'd also want you to consider funding our work here at Novara Media. In 2025, we are up against the millionaires, the billionaires, the Musks, the Murdochs. We want to be your megaphone, putting working people first and exposing the deficiencies of the media and political class. Let us do that for you. Let us champion your interests. The link is in the description below if you want to become a supporter, or just go to novaramedia.com/support. Give as little or as much as you can. £1 a month. It doesn't hurt. And you know what? That helps us build a new media for different politics. So we've established you're an economist at the IEA, very intimately connected to a certain political strand in this country since the 60s, but like you say, since 1945, really. Which is the year that Road to Serfdom was published, right? 45?
44.
44. With Routledge. People don't really know this, but Routledge, I believe, was the publisher. Do you know this?
I didn't.
They're like a big philosophy publisher, and people think it's kind of politically neutral. But at the time, I think, again, Routledge was they had a political project. They wanted to shine a spotlight on certain ideas. Anyway, so you are, Ash Sarkar famously said, I'm literally a communist. Mm-hmm. You are literally a neoliberal.
Literally, yes. It's not a word that I normally use. It's one of those terms that when it came up, I think it came up in the 80s, or was popularized at least, it was always used in a pejorative sense. And until a few years ago, I didn't know any people who called themselves neoliberals. But at some point, people just try to, as with gammon, some people just own it and say, yeah, well, then I am a gammon, so what? Okay. And I think that's what's happened with neoliberal as well. So if you take it literally, there was once a school of thought that actually did call itself neoliberal, but those were the West German post-war liberals, but they used it actually in the sense of not to mean a particularly radical form of liberalism, but rather the opposite. They said, well, okay, laissez-faire capitalism, 19th century classical liberalism, that was a bit too laissez-faire, and they believed in a version of liberal economics where the state would play a larger role than early liberals would have accepted, particularly when it comes to competition policy. But that's not what anyone means when they say neoliberal.
Yeah, so you're talking about ordo-liberalism, right?
Yes.
We're talking about lots of different things here, but you now accept the term neoliberal. You're happy to call yourself that. Prior to that, what would you have called yourself? What were your politics?
Well, there was a time when I would have simply said libertarian, and I still don't object to that. It's just that has the connotation of being almost an anarcho-capitalist, Murray Rothbard, David Friedman type, which as a student I was flirting with for a while. But I'm just a more boring kind of liberal. So I do accept a role for the state. And when you say libertarian, that sounds too much like you're trying to be too purist. Whereas I'd say, firstly, yeah, there is a role for the state, and I don't want to get into the business of saying what exactly that should be. I'm not trying to draw up a list of things, this is what the state should do, but rather I'd rather have a system where that also comes out of something which is almost like a market process. So have a very decentralized system, like in Switzerland, self-governing cantons, local authorities. And there you can have a difference between some cantons may provide something that is not available in others. And you have high tax and low tax cantons, and that would just, so the role of the state, that would be something that is determined almost in a market-like process. That would be my ideal system. So turn the whole world into a big Switzerland.
So you disagree with Thatcher then? She had the idea of low tax, minimal state. Didn't happen in practice very often, but that was the project. But there was also centralising of power in Westminster. So you think that's something she got wrong?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I can see where that was coming from. She thought that local authorities were captured by the far left, by Trotskyite groups, and probably true in some cases. I would simply have said, well, let them do that Trotskyist project, whatever they want to do, but they have to raise their own taxes then. And that would have been the arrangement in Switzerland. I don't think it ever happened there that you had a far-left council or canton, but it could in principle happen. It's just that if people don't like it, it's very easy to emigrate if you have government on a very small scale. And that would just be very different from international migration. It's just much harder to leave a whole country than to move 10 kilometers to the west. But yeah, ideally that should have been the project, to decentralize power politically. And that would have been, in the long term, a better project for a number of reasons. It just makes a lot more sense to have self-governing local units that can raise their own taxes and determine their own policies. It's generally the case that countries that are organized in such a way, they have more competing economic centers as well. So in Switzerland, you couldn't pick out a single place and say, this is the richest part of the country, in the way that in Britain, it is clearly the case that economic activity is concentrated in London very much. And yeah, I would just generally prefer a much more decentralized setup. So this is absolutely something where I would have, if I had been around in the 80s, where I would not have been a Thatcherite.
I think lots of people don't realise this, but Switzerland charges, in terms of tuition fees, about $1,000 a year. You know, and people often think, oh, Switzerland's like this, you know, low tax, which, you know, has lower tax than many Western European countries. But it has some policies which you think, well, that's something I like. Bernie Sanders would like that. Switzerland does it. And I think people have a strange view on Switzerland. I mean, we talk about lots of countries that get things wrong. There are some countries that get things right, you know, Taiwan with industrial policy, right? You create one of the world's 10 largest companies, TSMC. I think Switzerland's another one. So we agree on that. That's good. What would that mean? You're talking about cantons. What would that mean in the UK? What would it look like?
You would devolve a lot of tax-raising powers and political powers to local authorities, and some of them...
councils.
Yes, and some of them might then decide that they are too small, they don't have the economies of scale to be a meaningful political entity, and they could then merge or elect some kind of common forum, which would then become like a regional government. So I wouldn't want to look at a map and say, okay, we have to have this region here and this region there. They need to have a regional parliament. I wouldn't want to decide that from the center. It should be more like a bottom-up process, that you devolve powers initially to the councils themselves. And if they want to come up with a bigger unit, which would be the equivalent of a canton, they can do that, but that will be up to them, and you shouldn't try to centrally plan that from Whitehall or wherever.
So do you support the process that Labour's now intensifying with metro mayors, and you're not talking about mayors, you're talking about authorities, but what they're doing for metro mayors is they're creating larger unitary authorities. So for instance, in Hampshire, they're going to create an area of around 2 million people, comprising Portsmouth, Southampton, bits of the New Forest, Eastleigh, Romsey, places people probably haven't heard of. But that's going to be 2 million people. Or if you go further west, you've got Bournemouth, Poole, Christchurch. It's going to be 500,000 people. It is 500,000 people. So that's the sort of thing you say, well, actually, Labour's got the right idea. We need these larger authorities. Or like with Manchester and Andy Burnham, I think that was 7 or 8 authorities in one. Do you think that's a good thing or no?
Well, again, I wouldn't start from there. I would devolve power more locally and let them decide if there's a good economic reason, economies of scale, or if there is just some policy area where it doesn't make sense to decide one thing in isolation because it spills over to another one. Let them decide whether they want to, merge, join forces, or come up with something that would be like a canton. But I don't think you should start by merging authorities or centrally plan what the political makeup of the country should be like. So
just to be clear, so BCP did that, right? Bournemouth, Poole, Christchurch, there were 3 councils, they became one. So they did what you're talking about. The one in South Hampshire is different. That is effectively an imposition from central government. So we've talked about something.
But can I just go back to that for a second? What matters to me isn't so much what exactly the boundaries are, but that you have... What the main reason why we don't get local self-governance here is that politicians at the national level are afraid that if they devolve powers, they will be on the hook for stupid decisions. If local authorities then do things that that if they want to bankrupt themselves, they would be on the line for that ultimately. And what matters is that you devolve tax-raising powers as well, because then the central government doesn't have... It's not that Whitehall is just full of control freaks. It's just they know that at the local level, if things go wrong, they will still be blamed for it. And you have to devolve the tax-raising powers first so that when things go wrong, the cost will be borne locally. That would mean a badly run local government would just be a government with higher taxes. And people would then say, wait, why do we pay 3 times as much in council tax as the neighboring county, region, canton, whatever, when we don't get better public services for it, so that you get that market-like comparison. That's the idea. And once you devolve the tax system, then you can devolve political power. But you can't just say, okay, you guys do whatever you like, but when things go wrong, send the bill to us.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
The Economist did a great article about this. They were comparing Bristol and Gothenburg a few years ago. And, Gothenburg can build this incredible municipal infrastructure because it's generating the revenues and it knows what it can budget for and the return on investment, and it really looks at this stuff. And meanwhile, Bristol, a massive metropolitan area, awful public transport. But what happens when you've got somewhere, let's say there's a canton, Aberdeen, the greater Aberdeen metro area, and they say, actually, we want to drill for oil, we have access to local resources that we want to make the most of. 2 questions there. Obviously, you've got a national community. Somebody in Stirling or in Somerset might not support fracking. The UK is, after all, is a nation state. So when it comes to things like fracking, would you also allow that to be done locally?
Yes. You would just have to tolerate that some places will make decisions that you don't like. But you would also have a much stronger incentive to allow activities like that, because it would mean that the benefits, or a much greater slice of the benefits, stay in the local area. Whereas right now, even though it would generate a lot of wealth, it wouldn't stay in the area, so therefore you get incentives for NIMBYism. I would absolutely apply that to airports, for example, that if you had, say, Heathrow expansion, Gatwick expansion, whatever, that could be, if a lot of that tax revenue could stay in that locality, there would be much stronger incentives to be in favor of it, rather than now to block it, because they know, okay, the business will be bigger, there will be maybe some extra job opportunity job opportunities for us, but the tax revenue will all go to Downing Street, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We won't see a benefit here.
Do you think that's the biggest problem for the UK? So we can and will disagree about a bunch of policies, etc. But do you think that's the biggest thing holding back the UK, is the centralisation of power and not allowing different regions to effectively administer themselves in the way you're saying?
Well, I'd say the biggest thing holding back the UK economy is the inability to build anything. But
this would help solve that, right?
Yes, that would be the idea, yeah. But you could, in principle, do that in a centralized manner as well. It's just not the way I would ideally want to do it. But yeah, ideally, decentralization would help overcome the NIMBY problem, but you could also imagine a centralized state that doesn't have these NIMBY tendencies. So I wouldn't quite say it's the biggest problem holding the economy back, but it is clearly the NIMBY tendency and the way NIMBYs can effectively exercise a veto over everything and block everything they don't like. So that's the main thing.
This is interesting for me. So you're a libertarian. you have a commitment to the autonomy of the individual and their ability to lead their life as they see fit, and for communities to be relatively self-governing. But isn't that the basis of NIMBYism? So the idea that 5,000 people can block a project which fundamentally is in the public interest of 68 million people, right? Do you see a contradiction there?
I don't
The
really.
NIMBYist mindset being, somewhat comfortable with the libertarian mindset.
No, absolutely not. Because what NIMBYs want to do, the acronym itself is a bit of a misnomer. Not in my backyard. It isn't their backyard. What they're trying to block is stuff that you want to do in your backyard. So NIMBYism is very much opposed to the principle of property rights. Before the Town and Country Planning Act 1947, Britain basically had a system where the presumption was if you own land, you have a right to build on it, with many limitations, but that would be the default assumption. It can be overridden, but there has to be a reason for that. And that was then turned into a system, the system that empowers the NIMBYs now, where owning land doesn't really mean anything. It's technically yours on paper, but what you can do with it, that is politically decided. And I say that from then on, that's where the rot set in. So
you'd invert the argument. You'd say, actually, if you really double down on property rights, then this is half the problem gone.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. But what if it is your backyard? What if it is literally your backyard? Like, let's say there's HS2 and they're saying, look, sorry, this is your agricultural land. We're running, and let's say it's a great HS2, it's a quarter of the price that we're paying or whatever. It's a great project. Everybody likes it. And they say to various farmers, let's say through, I don't know, part of the Midlands, we're going to do a possession order. We're going to take some of your farmland. Do you think that's okay?
Well, I guess the way it worked in the Victorian age and until into the 20th century was that it would have been very lucrative to make an offer to the farmer and say, look, when we build this is going to create so much wealth. You can basically retire somewhere in the south of Spain and live in a mansion and live a great life, because what we're going to do with the land is much more valuable than using it for farming. And in that way, I don't see a problem there. Most landowners, including in agriculture, would be absolutely happy to sell their land to a developer. It's just the planning process is just blocking that.
No, but they aren't. No, but so the NIMBYism thing, for instance, we're building loads of tunnels. I'm not talking about the Bat Tunnel, but in terms of HS2, there are lots of tunnels which have basically meant that the route is subterranean, precisely because these farmers don't want to see it. That is a classic example of actually NIMBYism meaning not in my backyard. So would you say to those people, yep, sorry, HS2 is now going to cost twice as much because it is in your backyard? Sorry. Or if you're more like me, I believe in like a strong state, I'd say, well, it's in the public interest to do this really important project as cheaply as possible. I'm afraid you're going to have to put up with it.
Well, even there, I guess it would depend on how you define the property rights. So how far below the land does it go? Do you still have a right to block a development that is far below your land, or does it only extend up to a certain level? That would be like the right to fly over it, where you wouldn't say, okay, the property right to a plot of land extends infinitely into outer space.
That's what they're saying. So they're saying, you're building it, we don't want to see it. It has to be underground, at which point costs spiral. Mm-hmm. That's something you care about, I care about. Costs shouldn't be spiraling. So what do you say to those people? Like it or lump it?
Well, I would just generally have a system where it becomes easier to make financial offers, compensation offers, where it becomes possible to say, you won't like this, there's going to be some nuisance for you, but how about if we cut a deal? We offer you this much. For a lot of development projects, I guess that would solve the problem.
What if they reject the deal, though?
Then, I don't know. I'm not against, in some cases, there might be a case for overriding property rights, but I would set the bar very high.
Right.
I haven't looked at it in detail.
Kristian Niemietz,
I wouldn't completely rule it out for all circumstances.
Kristian Niemietz is becoming Xi Jinping pilled. Under certain conditions, the state can override private property rights. Okay. In terms of devolving competences, power, authority, we've talked about economic development, building. What about the rule of law? Would you devolve that as well?
There would be some general principles that you couldn't opt out of. So I'm not for... Well, as in Switzerland, you couldn't have, a canton couldn't say, we will bring back hanging. That would just be nationally determined. So you would have a common basis, and you could just have a lot of variation when it comes to tax levels and what should be publicly provided and in what way that should be done. That's
what about drugs, though? It's like the US, for instance, has devolved sort of drug policy. What would you say about that?
That could absolutely work in that way. Yeah, that would be locally decided.
Age of consent?
Probably leave that at a central level.
Alcohol?
Devolve. Yeah.
That'd be quite fun, right? You're like 14, you're like, okay, let's drive to somewhere. I shouldn't say that, should I? But okay, we devolve that. Okay.
But in practice, I don't see that there would be a difference there. It would just be you would, as a local authority decision maker, you would still bear in mind that there are economies of standardization. In some ways, you might not want to deviate too much from your neighbors, and it would just be a bit silly if everyone had a law that says alcohol from the age of 18, that you would individually say, but here it's going to be 19 and a half. So that will happen.
But what if, okay. So what if evangelical Christians or Orthodox Muslims or Jews, Haredim rather, let's say all of a sudden they are a majority in a part of London and they say, you know what, no more alcohol or no sex outside of marriage. What happens then?
Well,
and they control the Barnet councillors. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen. It's not a dog whistle or anything. I'm just trying to probe your argument here. And it could be any religion, right? Christian, Jew, Muslim. What if they start actually implementing quite a radical, morally based agenda? You think that's fine?
Up to a point, yes.
Because then that would undermine arguably the ability and the autonomy and the independence of the individual, which is what libertarianism cares about. So you'd be happy for mini regimes to be created, which fundamentally are at odds with your own personal beliefs?
Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with private clubs, say, coming up with rules for their own members that I wouldn't agree with, where I would simply say, well, if you don't like it, don't become a member of that club. And up to a point, you could apply that to local governments as well. Within limits, of course, there is the issue that you've already lived there, and it's different from, say, just joining a club where you could just give notice and terminate your membership. But yeah, the principle would be the same, that some places would come up with rules that I wouldn't like. And there I would simply say, well, I don't have to live there then. But where exactly the dividing line is, I haven't really thought about the edge cases. Where exactly would you say, okay, no, this is national level and you cannot alter it, this is local. But I would just, generally, my presumption would be in favor of local autonomy.
I mean, I know that's annoying, but I mean, and edge cases are just that, they're edge cases. But that's obviously where you have to work at the boundaries of a system.
But I'd absolutely accept that there would be places run in a way that I would strongly disapprove of, yeah.
Do you believe are nations real?
As long as people believe in them and see them as nations, sure, why not?
But do you think nations are real? I mean, this is there are people on the left who don't think they're real. Do you think nations are real? Do you think they're real entities?
Sure, I mean, in the sense that Christmas is real, because we all agree that it happens and we celebrate it.
Are you German? Do you feel German?
Well, not in the sense that I would suddenly feel out of place if I crossed the border into Austria or Switzerland. But yeah, obviously, if I lived in, let's say, on the other side of the world, and I met a German and then again, this wouldn't suddenly stop at the border. Of course, I would probably feel that I have more in common with that person than with the majority population of that place, if that is a place that is culturally very different and that I would just have moved to. So
like an anarcho-capitalist would basically say that, if you boil down the argument, something like Murray Rothbard or whatever, you boil it down, we're all effectively autonomous, that's the project anyway, autonomous sort of economic utility maximizing individuals, and a lot of the stuff that people care about, their heritage, their nationality, etc., that's kind of ripped away. You don't kind of buy that. You think this stuff matters to people, it needs to be acknowledged in politics? I wouldn't say acknowledged in politics. Most of that national identity, regional identity is something that doesn't really have strong policy implications. So if you compare, say, Bavaria has a very strong regional identity, very much like Scotland. It's just for them, this doesn't have policy implications. So there is no
meaningful separatist Bavarian movement in the way that there is in Scotland, for the simple reason that not because local or regional identity is weaker, but simply because it expresses itself in ways that have nothing to do with politics. So if Bavaria became a republic of its own, I can't see what exactly they would do differently politically. They would just be their regional identity is much more about the beer festivals and the local dialect and all that. And it would be, I lived there for a year, it would be things like me arriving, initially not understanding the dialect very well, and then refusing to speak in High German. That would be a marker of regional identity. It's clearly real to them, but it's just, they can do that, whether they're part of Germany, whether they are an independent country, that's just got nothing to do with politics. So I would just say these are things that I would keep mostly separate from political decisions.
So an uncharitable argument, Kristian, would say that on the right of politics, 40 years of libertarian or quasi-libertarian politicians, policymakers wanting to break down the barriers to globalize free trade, particularly across borders, that as a default setting since Reagan and Thatcher has actually found as a consequence in the 2020s, and I think this is indisputable, a resurgence of nationalism. Mm-hmm. And it's contributing to the collapse, well, collapse is a very strong word, the potential collapse of globalization as we've understood it really since 1990. The global market is changing in really profound ways. We're about to see potentially tariffs imposed by people like Trump on maybe Canada, Mexico, EU, etc. And one can argue that's born of a revolt against the kinds of political economy that you would champion. You know, we shouldn't have tariffs. We should have easy access to foreign markets. If you want to move your production from the US to China or to Mexico, that's good. And what that's created in the sort of medium term is people saying absolutely not. We're Americans. We're proud to be American. Make things in America. What do you make of that? And actually, a stronger attachment than I ever thought possible, if I'm being honest, to nation.
Okay, I don't have a problem with people identifying strongly with the nation, as long as that doesn't have strong policy implications, which, unfortunately, as you said, it seems to have in the Trumpian case, that Trumpism isn't just a form of populism, it isn't just a culture war coalition that he's building, but it has strong policy implications, especially in trade, that, yes, he is a protectionist. It's just I don't see anything inevitable about this. So you have this resurgence in a kind of nationalism in Britain too, but so far it doesn't seem to come with a protectionist agenda. So reform, whatever you make of them, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice are not protectionists. And I said Trumpism is much more of a culture war phenomenon. And the protectionism part, the economic implications, they are very much optional and personality driven. That's something that is really just Trump himself. There are videos of him from the 1980s when long before he seriously thought about becoming a political figure, where he already has this protectionist mindset. In that case, he had the baddie was a different one. Back then, I think it was Japan that he was obsessed with, but he always had this protectionist streak because he somehow thought free trade means foreigners taking advantage of America. So that is something which he brought with him. That is his personal baggage, and I hope it doesn't become actual policy, because with Trump, I mean, he is a cultural phenomenon, but he isn't somebody with a strong attachment to any particular ideology. But it's just, if anything is Trumpism in a real sense, yeah, the protectionism would be there. It's just I would not interpret the rise of Trumpism as a backlash against globalization per se. You could very easily imagine a Trumpist political project that just didn't have a view on economic policies. That's
really
normally, yes. Isn't Reform UK basically
but
like
not
that?
Won yet, right? I mean, I think that's probably the difference. I mean, with Trump has. I mean, and look, the jury's out, right? Maybe in 3 years we're like, yeah, Kristian's right, but.
No, I'm not making any particular predictions.
No, I know.
It could well be that he will implement a protectionist agenda. I'm just saying it's not going to end well for him economically. And you could easily imagine a Trumpism without that. That's really his personal agenda. I don't follow American politics closely. I would just be very surprised if a lot of the people who voted for him said, if you asked them, yes, I do this specifically because of the tariff policy.
No, but they would say, I want to make America great again. And we've lost a lot of jobs to China. By the way, quite a lot of that's automation, but park that, they have lost some jobs to overseas. We've lost a lot of jobs to China, to Mexico, and we need to make things in America again. How is it possible that the Chinese middle class in the last 30 years, which, by the way, empirically true, has grown exponentially, whilst there are towns and places in the United States which just completely fallen apart over the last 40 to 50 years? That's what they would say. And, you know, this is not, I don't think it's up for debate in so much as the literal, I mean, it was until maybe Trump won again, the literal vice president wrote a book about this, you know, Hillbilly Elegy. And so that's clearly a part of their political project, which is globalization failed. It left parts of America behind. We can't do that again. What matters the most is us as a national community. And if that means we don't have cheaper stuff made by the Chinese, by the Mexicans, so be it. Now, I agree with you. In the short term, it's going to create a lot of inflation, right? I agree with you on that. But I think they've been quite honest about setting their stall out. And they're saying goodbye to a certain variation of globalization, right?
Yes. Yeah, but I mean, Trump would never have called himself a defender of liberalism, of liberal globalization. He quite explicitly defines himself against, what used to be the old Republican establishment, which was still in the Reaganite, which would have accepted most of Ronald Reagan's economic legacy. And yeah, it is, he markets himself quite clearly as a deviation from that. What did surprise me is how quickly he managed to turn the Republican Party into basically his personal vehicle, and how quickly that would be accepted, and that even some of that this commitment to liberal economics among the old school Republicans, that was really just skin deep, and that it could be so quickly replaced by Trumpism.
Because you tell me what your thoughts are on this. I think for most of the last 10 to 15 years, people like yourself would be worried that the left is going to introduce things like tariffs, is going to create friction with regards to trade, is going to undermine that world we've known really since 1990. It wasn't Bernie Sanders. Actually, it was Donald Trump. It was people from the side of politics that they would most closely associate with. Do you think that your fellow travelers in the US, people who would identify as neoliberals or, you know, free market capitalists, do you think they're gone now from the Republican Party? Do you think it's over for like a decade?
Probably from the Republican Party, yes. I'm sure they are there somewhere, probably in think tanks or whatever. But it is true that, so an example here, a good example of that tendency that you mentioned would be Johann Norberg. You may have come across. He wrote a book in defense of globalization in the early 2000s in response to the anti-globalization movement that was strong in the universities at the time. So this was when I was an undergraduate in Berlin. This was definitely a big thing. Everyone had to join the anti-globalization movement. That was all the rage, and that was clearly associated with the political left. He has now written a kind of sequel or updated version of that, where he says, well, back then it was mostly the far left that I was worried about. It's now that agenda is coming in parts of the world, but it's being implemented by the political right, by the Trumpian right. So yeah, that would definitely be part of that vibe shift. That the first edition of his book, it's all about critiquing left-wing arguments. The sequel or updated version saying, well, yeah, that is still there, the left anti-globalization arguments. I'm still opposed to that. But however, it's now, the second edition is a much more balanced book where he, about half of the time, takes aim at the anti-liberal right and defines himself against that.
Which is now the sort of hegemonic faction of the American right.
Yeah.
It seems the post-liberal, industrial sort of dirigismo, well, dirigismo is a strong word, but yeah, protectionist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it does mean that if you call yourself a classical liberal, free marketeer, whatever, libertarian leaning, the old formula that means you are sort of economically right-wing, culturally, socially left-wing, that is no longer true. And that has broken down. That would be the consequence of
But
it.
I suppose the home for those people now is the Democrats.
Again, I don't follow American politics very much. I don't know whether there might well be a wing of the Democrats that would be more sympathetic to them, and if they can have an influence on them, then why not?
Yeah. Has the last 40 years of the Thatcherite experiment been a failure? Has trickle-down economics failed?
Well, where to start? There's no such thing as trickle-down economics. I mean, who is a trickle-down economist? I've never... So trickle-down economics seems to be the way it's characterized by its opponents, and it only has opponents. I've never met a proponent. The idea that you should just make the rich rich, and then somehow this will filter through. And that's not how a market economy works. The way an entrepreneur becomes rich is that they have a great business idea, and they launch a successful product, and in that way they enrich other people, and then the wealth trickles up to them. That is the idea.
Didn't Reagan have some famous formulation about how money trickles down? I think that's where it came from, no?
Well, if so, then he shouldn't have used that phrase.
Because 40 years later,
really,
here we are.
Really never the idea. So that's not, you're not going to find this in Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, any of the people who Reagan may or may not have taken inspiration from, but it's not a theory that I'd recognize.
So there's a criticism of that, which is not even a left-wing one now, which is that somebody like Ruchir Sharma, who's at the FT, smart guy, he would say, look, these people have spoken and they've talked about shrinking the state for decades. They didn't shrink the state. Actually, the American state has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger since the 1930s. Reagan, in his first term, maybe he kept it the same size as a percentage of overall, the government as a percentage of overall, economic production. But even in his second term, it got bigger. They talked about reducing the state to cut taxes, but actually the tax cuts were all funded by deficits anyway. You can't do that forever. And as a result, you see public debt massively rise. I mean, Reagan and Thatcher ran deficits. They weren't fiscal conservatives.
Well, Thatcher was.
But
Reagan not, but okay, he had the US dollar, the world's reserve currency.
True. But Thatcher didn't run surpluses. So those tax cuts were funded by deficits and North Sea oil, right?
Well, I don't remember the exact figures, but public debt as a proportion of GDP must have gone down in the Thatcher era. So that is, Thatcherism is in that sense quite different from Reaganomics. Reaganomics was clearly not fiscally conservative. Thatcherism was.
Even though deficits every year, you think that's fiscally conservative? Was there different views on this? So you think that's fiscally conservative?
Well, I would have to look at the exact figures again. It was, but if you have a shrinking proportion of debt to GDP, then that is broadly fiscally conservative. She certainly didn't. She did not believe in tax cuts funded through deficits. So she would never have had an equivalent of the mini budget, because in the Thatcher years there were no net tax cuts until quite late in the day. So there was a reshuffling of taxation from direct to indirect taxes, but the big tax cuts really just happened towards the end.
There were tax rises originally, right? I think in her first budget, she actually increased taxes somewhat on North Sea oil, ironically.
Could be, yeah. But there was reshuffling, but she was initially fiscally conservative. Well, until the end. So the tax cuts came once the spending cuts had been done.
Yeah, people don't realise this, but the top rate of tax was very high for most of the Thatcher premiership. I think 60%. I could be wrong. You said Liz Truss. So she screwed up, right?
Yeah, well,
she gave you guys a bad name for a very long time.
Well, she personally didn't. She never said that she took ideas from us. She explicitly said the influence of the IEA on me has been overstated. I don't think we even make an appearance in her book. But the association that has been created, that clearly created a backlash. I'd simply say about the mini budget, it was a massively fiscally expansionary budget at a time when inflation was running high. You had 10% inflation, and then you come up with a budget where, it was never implemented, but if it had been, where you increase borrowing by, it would have been something like 4% of GDP or so, on top of the deficit that was already there, after coming out of COVID with massive transfers and the debt to GDP ratio going through the roof. And that was, firstly, exactly the wrong time. A year later, you might have been able to get away with something like that, but not at that time, not in a post-pandemic scenario with super high inflation already. But so even if macroeconomic conditions would have been more favorable, you shouldn't do the tax cuts first. You do the spending cuts first, and when you can afford it, then you cut taxes. That would have been a classical liberal approach, and that's if you look at any IEA publication on taxation and government spending, that would have been the line. So we've been perfectly consistent.
For the record, though, she was very close to your former colleague, Mark Littlewood.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah,
did she give him a peerage? Or he was an advisor, or he had some very close role to. So she was, very connected.
Yeah,
to
they've known each other their whole adult life, of course. Yeah, and in terms of her overall worldview, of course, I'd be more sympathetic to her than to, say, Theresa May. There's no argument about that. That she broadly believes in free market, classical liberalism. What I reject is just the insinuation that somehow the IEA or any think tank is responsible for specific policies that she came up with, because that is just really not how the think tank sector works.
Were you guys in a WhatsApp going, oh my God, when it's all falling apart, the IEA WhatsApp, you Mark Littlewood and go, fuck, she's really fucked us for a long time here? Well, because fair or not, there is that association, right?
I think there wasn't even that realization at the time. So I wasn't even paying that much attention to the whole Truss project, because my thinking was simply, okay, she talks like somebody who is sympathetic to free market ideas. But then again, she was a cabinet minister under David Cameron for 10 years, been part of the government project for 12 years. I just didn't buy the idea that she would be so radically different. I thought, well, she will sound a bit different, but she will ultimately just be another generic Tory. And I just took a let's wait and see approach.
So let me put the boot on the other foot. If there was a left-wing PM and they came in and like at Novara, we were like, this is great. I mean, there would be people that would be cynical about it, right? Such as yourself. Go, well, they're the Labour leader, they're the PM. They can only change so much. There's the deep state, there's just being lazy, there's countervailing pressures, there's the bond market. Okay, they might do one or two good things, but I'm not that excited. People like yourself. But there would clearly be other people who'd be saying, this is our person, this is progress, this is movement in the right direction. And if then that person screwed up as badly as Liz Truss and became a national laughingstock, I mean, she was literally the Prime Minister for 44 days. I think we would
technically 49, but yeah, it was.
Yeah,
basically, it was
we would be like,
heartbeat.
Okay, our brand of politics has been absolutely destroyed. There must have been those conversations in the IEA, Kristian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is, of course, a public association.
Yeah.
And we noticed that that's just when you go out and give a talk somewhere, that you would get a hostile reception, because people in the audience would say, but surely that has to be your doing. So yeah, you noticed that, of course. Yeah. I didn't initially, but yes, as soon as it all ended in tears, yeah, of course, I realized this association, unjustified in my opinion, but there you go, life isn't fair. That clearly has done reputational damage.
What politicized you initially? Because just talking to you now, you're quite calm, you're quite analytical, but you're also you're very ideological. You're committed to a very ideological politics. That's not often, those two things don't always go hand in hand. So where does your politics come from?
Well, I was initially a bit of a lefty as a teenager, but a kind of confused, ignorant lefty. It was only skin deep. And
how were you a lefty? What causes did young Kristian support?
I can't remember in detail. It was more of a vibe than specific causes. I guess even then, if you had asked me, I wouldn't have been able to give a coherent answer. I just had an emotional attachment. I thought being a lefty means being a good person, and had that attachment. I still had for a while after discovering liberal ideas. I just developed a grudging appreciation of the market economy at some point, and started thinking, well, maybe capitalism isn't as horrible as everyone says. Maybe capitalism is better than its reputation. So I must have been 17 or so, and I read something by a liberal economic journalist who explained in very simplified terms, concepts like the invisible hand of the market, Adam Smith, the idea that in a market economy that you can do things that end up benefiting other people, even if that is not your intention. Even if you are a selfish bastard, you can still behave as if you cared about the well-being of others simply because that is the only way you can make money in a market economy. I read about that and thought, well, this actually makes sense, and I started to see that pattern around me. That was a change. I started to apply this to things I observed in real life.
Capitalism doesn't make that argument anymore. So that's like the whole argument of private vice is public virtue. And that's not just Smith, it's, Bernard Mandeville, this idea that, well, actually, that may seem self-centered and selfish and nasty, but it serves the public interest. But now when you see people defending capitalism, they don't make that argument anymore. They say,
I do.
I don't think many people will say, actually, the private vice of XYZ is public virtue. They just say, well, if they want to be that rich, they can. Fuck the rest of you. That is genuinely, I think, the default defense of that stuff now. I do. I think, and that is a big shift to say.
Well, then they shouldn't.
To 20 years ago.
I haven't come across that, but if somebody does that, then I'd say they shouldn't. And I also wouldn't. I don't like slogans like greed is good. I can see why somebody would say that on Twitter to trigger the lefties and all that. But the Adam Smith argument was never that you shouldn't try to be a good person or anything. It's just that you wouldn't want a social system that relies exclusively on everybody being nice all the time. That, of course, if somebody also has charitable objectives and wants to do intentionally good things, that's even better. But most of the good things that a private entrepreneur will do will probably be somewhat selfishly motivated, and that's okay. If as long as your economic order is based on voluntary exchange, you have to offer people something that they want. Otherwise, they won't buy from you, and you won't become rich. I mean, that's the simplified argument, and I think it's basically true.
So you were attracted to left-wing politics. You then move over to the sort of libertarian right.
Well, not immediately. So for a while, I tried to reconcile that, thinking, well, maybe I'm. But I had that conflict that pro-market arguments made sense to me on a logical level, but I still felt left-wing for several years. So I just, for a while, I thought maybe a good compromise would be to be a social democrat.
Or a market socialist, like Tito.
I skipped that stage. I went straight to, social democracy. I was a member of the SPD for a while, Social Democratic Party, but then they had that conflict between what you could call the Blairite wing, the more the wing that is okay with the market economy, and the more traditionalist wing. And I just realized, no, I actually very much associate with the Blairite wing. I think their arguments make a lot more sense. And at some point, I then realized, well, that wing, the pro-market wing within the Social Democrats, is always going to be a bit of an outlier. If you're a member of a social democratic party and you want it to be liberal, well, then you're actually a liberal and should just do liberalism. And that's what I did. Then I switched to the Free Democratic Party.
Who are very unpopular now.
Yes. Well, they were unpopular then.
Right.
So
yeah,
I didn't join them for the popularity.
Does it? And I don't want you to take offense at this because it's something I've thought about with myself. So your attraction to radical political ideas, did it meet some sort of deeper psychological need for you? Like, what did your parents do? What's your parents' value system?
I guess they are broadly social democrats, but not super political. It's not that we would have political arguments at Christmas. Say.
Yeah. Are they religious?
No.
What do they do? Sorry, I find this stuff really interesting. What do they do?
They're retired now.
Yeah, but what do they do?
My father used to work for Opel, the car company. Used to do something about cost calculation, so something I never fully understood it, but something economics related, but on the business level. Worked for the Consumer Advisory Center.
So for me personally, I'm obviously on the left, and it's something I think is quite an unattractive trait, and as I've gotten older, I've tried to get rid of it. But my mum was a Catholic, and so she was quite self-righteous, and I think that's something that definitely inflected my political development, like as a child, as a young adult. So when I ask that question, I don't want you to take offense, or I think there's generally something to it. We've spoken recently to Gary Stevenson, right, who talks about inequality and how things are just going to get worse. And, he comes from a religious background. And I do sometimes think that that shadow of, your parents' worldview, religion, more often than not, you do detect it in the hinterland or the CV of very sort of ideological people.
No, nothing like that. No.
No?
No.
Are you religious?
No.
Atheist?
Never. Well, I mean, atheist sounds a bit too Richard Dawkinsy. Just non-religious, agnostic.
If you could live in any country in the world apart from Switzerland, where would it be?
I guess Liechtenstein then. That's pretty close, basically, like an extended canton. But yeah, I mean, that's still very much that very decentralized model, and also ending up in a very liberal place. So it would have to be something like that. Otherwise, I would quite like to know Hong Kong, Singapore a bit better. But yeah, if I had to pick a place, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, that sort of arrangement.
Do you view that the sort of the radical liberal tradition you're a part of? Do you view it as socially and historically contingent, which is to say, it's the development of a certain European ideology, or do you think actually no, this is a blueprint that any society in the world could adopt and be a part of?
Something closer to the latter. So we can, for example, we see that in the fact that a lot of our publications are translated into lots of languages, and it isn't just that the readership only comes from Britain and America. There is a demand for this around the world, but of course, in relatively limited and nerdy circles. But I would say the whole point of liberalism is that it doesn't offer a vision of the good life. It doesn't tell people what moral values they should adhere to. It's more like a meta-philosophy. It's a general framework within which you can live according to whichever values you want to choose, live how you see fit. And therefore, in principle, this could work anywhere. So if you had a very conservative religious society where for some reason or other a crazy libertarian would end up on top, then, well, in their daily interactions with one another, people would still stick to their religious conservative values. You would just have a liberal framework where it is now legally allowed to deviate from that, but there might, of course, still be strong social repercussions. You might be socially ostracized if you live a completely different lifestyle. But then, yeah, as a liberal, I don't want to change culture or lifestyles or anything. I just want a general legal framework in which people can live their lives as they see fit, and how that would turn out in practice, what that would look like on the ground. That's where you would see massive differences between different cultures.
That's interesting what you say about liberalism, about, as a meta-philosophy, we don't want to tell people how to live. In 2025, people do want to be told how to live, right? That does seem to be the trend. And I don't want to tell people how to live either, right?
Yeah.
But you look at the success of somebody like Andrew Tate, you don't want to go overboard. He's not as successful as he perhaps likes to portray, but clearly, Jordan Peterson, clearly there is a vacuum for many people in the West, particularly younger men, who want to be told what to do. They want an orthodoxy. They want a regimen. They want a sense of obligation to a certain lifestyle. By the way, also religion fills that vacuum. Do you think that in 30, 40, 50 years' time, people will look back at people like you or me saying, look, we don't want to tell people what to do, as a bit of an sort of historical artifact?
Could well be. There is that theory that that liberalism is really an aberration, in the sense that human nature is quite tribal, and that's where that need to belong to a community and maybe even having an authority figure being told what to do is where that need comes from, and having a political settlement which completely deviates from that, is a bit of an anomaly. And that's also why you don't find any. You're not going to find classical liberals who, if you ask them where do your political persuasions come from, then no liberal is going to say, I was always a liberal. No one's going to say, I've always felt that way. It's always something that, as I said before, I used to be a lefty. Some would say I used to be a conservative. It's always there used to be something else, and then develop liberalism more in a cerebral way by reading about it. So it is quite counterintuitive, the idea that you tolerate moral values, lifestyles that you may strongly disapprove of, but you just say, well, it's none of my business. So that is counterintuitive, and but I'd say to the extent I don't see necessarily a contradiction between that need to belong to a community and maybe having a hierarchy structure, whatever, and that can exist in a liberal settlement. It would just have to be satisfied privately. It just I wouldn't. So I guess Victorian Britain would have been a liberal-ish political settlement, but clearly strong social norms and people being members of community groups, whether that's religious or trade unions or just things like the friendly societies. You had that need for community life, community spirit being organized in that way, and that's fine. I would just like to keep that as far away from politics as possible.
Well, Marxists would say that the liberal impulse to maximize the autonomy of the individual through market structures, that necessarily breaks down the kinds of social relationships that you're talking about, right? The phrase from the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. All fixed relations, frozen fixed relations, disintegrate. There's something to that, no?
Well, in the sense, mostly that it makes it less necessary. So 200 years ago, you wouldn't even have been able to survive if you didn't have a strong network of support, and now you can live in a more autonomous way, and that can undermine some traditional social structures. Not necessarily a bad thing. But again, ideally, I don't mind people joining associations that are maybe internally hierarchical and that do tell their members these are the right values, this is how you live your life. Ideally, it shouldn't be Andrew Tate, but there has to be some better alternative there.
Was the biggest mistake of the Soviet Union giving Ayn Rand an education?
The biggest mistake of the Soviet Union was coming into existence in the first place. It should never have been a thing.
So giving Ayn Rand an education, in terms of all the mistakes of the USSR, where does that rank?
Ayn Rand probably, I don't think she made much use of her education. I know that quote, but it's not that she made much use of her Soviet education. She even, I think part of what radicalized her once she had moved to the United States was precisely that experience, that she met Western intellectuals who were very keen on the Soviet Union and who said, well, this is great. And she's saying, no, I just escaped from that place. And what you have here is so much better. You should defend it. And I guess that must have been a radicalizing experience for her, that 1920s, 30s America must have seemed incredibly rich to her, must have seemed incredibly economically advanced to her, and to then come across an intellectual elite which doesn't value that kind of system at all. And that must have been a radicalizing experience for her.
Do you think it's a bit daft, though? Because obviously, the United States in 1900 was 50 years, and this is something that Stalin actually said, right, in the 20s, I think. It was 50 years ahead of Tsarist Russia. This idea that where she came from was poor by virtue of the USSR.
No, I'm not saying that.
No, I know you're not, but it's just so you say it should never have existed?
The USSR, no. Absolutely not. They should have gone with, okay, we don't know what the Kerensky government would have turned into, but I don't know much about Tsarist Russia, but from what little I know, there were some modernizing, liberalizing tendencies in the late Tsarist era. They should have continued like that and just have become more like Western Europe.
And what about Communist China? They've taken 700 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years.
Well, they have done that by deviating from their initial ideology, which is Maoism, so that they only started eliminating poverty once they had basically given up on the ideas that inspired the revolution. And you had Fukuyama here on this podcast once, and he says that in The End of History, where he says, well, if you talk to any official in China today, they don't care about Marxism, Leninism anymore. And maybe that's a bit too strong a statement. That's not quite true. That they are a mixed economy. They're clearly not a free market economy, but they owe their wealth to deviating from the Maoist experiment.
Is that true?
Yes.
They deviate from Maoism, but so Deng Xiaoping, who's the person we're talking about here, he takes China on a fundamentally different course to Maoism, right? After the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping dies a committed Marxist. That's what he says, and the argument that Deng makes is, it's actually quite an understandable one, which is that China is a poor country. And in order to move to a new mode of production, we have to unleash the forces of production. We need to embrace a market economy. We need to develop our technological base. We need to do all of these things as a necessary step to achieving socialism, which, by the way, is something Marx would have agreed with. He initially said that the most developed countries, like Germany, at the end of the 19th century, would be at the forefront of revolutionary change because they were the most technologically, economically developed. So Deng Xiaoping, yes, it's a break with Mao, but I don't think that necessarily means that it's a break with sort of communist thoughts. So that idea of actually socialists should want to unleash the forces of production, but in a way that serves the people, which is basically, you might think it's bullshit, but that's basically what the Chinese Communist Party claims it's doing. Since Deng, at the very least, we don't need to relitigate what goes, we can if you want, but in regards to that 700 million people, since Deng, that seems to be working really, really well.
Compared to what went on before, but you have to compare to a realistic counterfactual. If the Chinese Revolution had never happened, the whole of China could have become a big Taiwan. And Taiwan industrialized way ahead of China, and they are now richer than Britain. That is where the whole of China could be today.
Isn't that kind of what is happening, though, at the moment? That's the present sort of trend.
Well, okay, but there's a lot of
it might not be in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of catch-up growth. China seems rich compared to where they were when Mao died, or even 10 years later. But I think in global terms, they are roughly in line with the global average, I think, in terms of GDP per capita. They are not a rich country. Of course, if you are catching up,
there are hundreds of millions of very rich people in China. Rich people in China, right? By European standards, there are hundreds of millions of them.
Yeah, but things like, say, measures like median incomes, you would not look at China and say, wow, that's brilliant. This is what we want to be like. It's just they opened their markets, opened themselves to global markets, introduced limited forms of private property protection and contracts and all that. And as a result, got out of the worst kind of poverty that they inherited from the Maoist period. But as I said, you have to compare this to realistic counterfactuals. The whole of China could be like Taiwan now. There's no reason why they shouldn't have been able to develop like that. Taiwan split from what would then become the People's Republic of China, 1949, starting from the exact same level, same cultural, institutional inheritance and all that. Taiwan today is richer than Britain. And so the whole of China could have been if the revolution hadn't happened.
So Taiwan's really fascinating for me because you've got TSMC, the world's largest producer of microprocessors, integrated circuits, and super successful. It's coming up to $1 trillion company, which, by the way, Europe doesn't have any of those. And it's a direct outgrowth of state-led industrial policy. And it's the kind of industrial policy I suspect you wouldn't like, right? So it's interesting for me that you're talking about Taiwan as this, and I agree, Taiwan's...
Well, it's all relative, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying
but it's doing superbly
Taiwan,
well,
Taiwan is the libertarian paradise. But if I had a choice...
Anything but, right? Anything but libertarian. Very strong industrial policy. Or Samsung's another one. People talk about South Korea as well, markets. Samsung, the levels of corruption between the central government in South Korea and Samsung over the last 60, 70 years, nepotism, closed contracts, this is not a firm in the sense that we think in the US or in Europe, a free market firm. It's not. So I find it really interesting that people that defend free markets point to South Korea and Taiwan as the sort of exemplars of... Well, they're not socialist either. They're something else, right?
In relation, if I had a choice between living in a purely socialist economy and a mixed economy with a strong industrial strategy, of course, I would prefer the latter. But I'm not saying this is the ideal. It's just all relative compared to Maoist China or even Dengist early China. Yeah, Taiwan vastly preferable. But there are, and I haven't looked at the details of this, of the economic history of these places. But there are economists who also say, well, that industrialization strategy that was not actually the reason for the success, and that you had bigger productivity growth in those sectors of the economy that did not benefit from this kind of nepotism, that had to develop under more market-like conditions. And there is the argument, I don't know whether it's true, I haven't looked at this in detail. Yeah. I'm just saying I know that there are economists who study that part of the world and who do argue they would have developed probably even faster without that industrial strategy.
Taiwan, 25 million people, they have $1 trillion company, and I think that's quite unusual, no?
Is it really?
Well, the only other similar place is California, right? On Earth. You could say Switzerland, I suppose. They've got some pretty big companies, but not that big.
Well, I mean, Taiwan isn't super rich in absolute terms. They are richer than Britain, but they are not California or Switzerland either. It's just, well, if you start from a low base and then you bring in private property rights and free contracts, you are going to have, under any circumstances, you're going to have a fairly rapid level of economic development. And then if you then also do some industrial policy, that doesn't prove that the industrial policy, that is the magic ingredient which made that. No,
I'm not saying it's magic ingredient. No, I'm not saying it's a magic ingredient, but it's something that maybe you're wrong about.
As I said, I'm not
maybe state-level industrial policy is a good thing. Because the whole thing about like the people on the right in this country have bashed the left, saying don't back winners, look at British Leyland, and it's like, well, now we're in 2025. Let's look at TSMC. Let's look at Samsung. Let's look at post-war Japanese industrial policy, which was pretty damn effective until the early 1990s. Actually, yeah, they did pick winners. The US increasingly it does kind of pick winners in terms of the digital economy. It does pick winners.
Well, one argument is that in the case of Taiwan and maybe to a lesser extent South Korea, it was an export-led strategy, and that meant even if you have your internal attempt at winner picking, most of the outcomes will still be determined by the global market that you're trying to cater to, and in a sense that does the winner picking for you, and the state activity is then quite marginal to that. But as I said, that's not specifically my argument. I don't know enough about the exact industrialization history.
I've got one more question, but I'll just stick on Taiwan for a second. If people thinking, what on earth are they talking about? TSMC produces most of the world's most advanced integrated circuits, which use the really, really like ultra tiny, I can't even, the how small these transistors are is just mind-boggling. Most of those are produced in Taiwan. It produces a lot of other integrated circuits beyond just the most advanced two. Now, TSMC is started by a gentleman called Maurice Chang, who's literally invited there by the Taiwanese government saying, and this is a small, poor country, we're going to give you billions of dollars to build this company which does foundries. They actually make the microprocessors. Companies like ARM or Intel design them. And it's a bet that really pays off. And I feel like in the West, we're not really... Taiwan is better at that stuff than any European country. Like, that really should be a huge kick up the arse for us as Europeans, but we don't talk about it enough. I've got one more question. Are you ready?
Go on.
What do you think it is?
Who funds you?
Yes! Who funds the IEA, Kristian?
I'm afraid I can't tell you.
Why?
Because people don't, and quite rightfully, they don't want Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion to show up at their doorstep.
But you want to be, I mean, these are all hackneyed arguments for you, I'm sure, but you want to be changing and influencing policy and political decisions, which is perfectly legitimate in a democracy. But when you're doing that, surely you need to disclose the people who are funding your work.
No. Why? People should evaluate the arguments on their own terms and say, I agree with it or I don't agree with it. And I've never seen that question, okay, you probably don't mean this entirely literally now, but I've never seen anyone ask that question really in good faith, in the sense of thinking this somehow helps the argument. It always comes as an insinuation that you don't really believe what you're saying, you're just lobbying for someone, you're probably secretly a socialist and you're just a fantastic actor.
Sadly. You're obviously very clever about it. It's a shame you're not a socialist. No, I don't think that, but I think there's a reasonable thing to presume, which is that generally speaking, people pay money for outcomes, and that those outcomes aren't always necessarily being pursued because they align with the broader public interest. They may align with the particular interest of an individual or a company. And I think, one of the arguments for the market is that markets, through the price system, maximize available information to all participants. So it is ironic that you don't disclose information in regards to who funds you, because it's the exact same argument that's made for the market, right? You have maximal information, you can make a very informed decision, but we don't apply that to the IEA.
And in what way would you use that information? How would that change any IEA publication that you read?
Well, you'd have some people who do it in bad faith, right? They'd be just, I'm not going to read that. It's funded by so-and-so. Some people do that.
But these are the ones who aren't going to read it anyway.
But no, there'll be other people saying, well, okay, this gentleman or this institution has funded this piece of research with the IEA, but he's saying something completely different here. Why? Or it's published this finding and it differs from what they funded here for this reason. That's interesting. Actually, that would give you more confidence in think tanks and the third sector. So I just find it, I do see your point and your counter argument, but I just think, particularly if you believe in the capacity of the individual to arrive at their own decisions, which is what liberals do, you want to endow them and furnish them with the maximum amount of information, surely. Surely.
Well,
in certain edge cases,
there's such a thing as privacy as well.
In edge cases, I get it.
If you support causes that might be controversial and you don't want the backlash, then I don't see a problem with somebody saying, well, I don't want my name out there. I want that to remain confidential. And maximum market information it doesn't include confidential agreements, and this should be one of those things that should be purely private. If somebody wants to say in public, yes, I do support the IEA, then of course they can do that. But we just leave that up to them. We don't have a policy on that.
But if somebody's commissioning research, for instance, that Ozempic doesn't work, right? And it's a rival pharmaceutical company that's doing that. I mean, and I'm not suggesting that you haven't done that, but that's something where you'd want to know who's funding that research, wouldn't you? Ozempic doesn't work.
But that's exactly the difference here. Because when it comes to something like medical research, there is no way that you can judge that for yourself, right? You have to either trust the source or you don't. Whereas with anything that we say, that's why it's full of references, you can't judge for yourself. You can either say, yeah, that seems plausible to me, or it doesn't. It's an economic argument. We're not producing, say, numbers that you cannot independently verify. You can read it as skeptically as you like. You can go back to the references, to the original sources and saying, does the paper that they're citing, does it actually say what they claim they say? You can do all that, or you can just read it very critically, thinking, yeah, well, this comes from a free market angle, it's probably biased, and read it in that way. And you can judge for yourself. And that's why this conflict of interest argument doesn't apply. That only applies really in areas where, with a clinical trial, there's no way I can judge for myself. I can't run my own clinical trial at home. And that's why this is a completely different argument there. We're, in that case, in that sense, much more like, say, economic commentary, where you read an article in The Economist or wherever, and then you just ask yourself, is this plausible? Do I agree with this or not?
You know who owns The Economist, right? Like, for instance, I might read something in the Daily Mail or a Murdoch publication, Times, and I know who owns that publication, or I know who the shareholders are, or Novara Media. You know, if you want to know who funds us, we have a page. You might say it goes overboard. 80% from our supporters, bit of YouTube ads, etc., etc., etc. And if we didn't have that publicly, people might be able to say, well, actually, I'm not going to listen to them because I know they're funded entirely by Unite the Union, or they're funded by this one guy, Dale Vince. And so maybe there's an argument that actually it would help build your credibility more. Maybe you don't care about that, I don't know, but maybe it would actually help you to disclose the people that fund the organization.
I mean, I'm relatively agnostic about that. The policy might change in the future. We do release some information, just not, for example, a breakdown. This much comes from companies, that much from private individuals, and this much from foundations, that sort of macro level breakdown. And some publications say this was sponsored by a grant from, for example, my healthcare stuff. I wrote a book on healthcare 8 years ago. That was all part of a Templeton project where the Templeton Foundation, where they do say it's okay to put our name up there. We're happy to be associated with that, and then we do it. But otherwise, there's a strong case for leaving that to the individual. And if somebody doesn't want their name in the public domain, don't want to be associated with controversial causes, then we respect that. And I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Kristian, I wanted you to shout at me. I wanted you to walk out. I wanted you to scream about how
next time.
Maybe next time. Maybe we'll do a part 2. We need to fall out. It's been a pleasure. We do agree on the localism thing. That's good to know. Kristian Niemietz, Thanks for coming on Downstream.
My pleasure.